Hi, and welcome again to our last learning objectives for this module, Module 7, Saving, Investment, and the Financial System. The third learning objective is to understand the market for loanable funds. We have three primary objectives. We're going to take a look at describing how the financial system coordinates saving and investment. We're going to draw and label the supply and demand for loanable funds. We're going to describe how government policies, specifically savings incentives, investment incentives, and we're going to take a look at government budget deficits and surplus affects the demand and supply diagram for loanable funds. So let's go ahead and get into it. So our first primary objective is to describe how the financial system coordinates savings and investment. Okay, so what we're going to do is take a look at a model, and this model of the financial system is going to help us understand the idea that the financial system is going to take the savings from, and it's just easier if we think about this in terms of the savings of private savings of households, and then maybe turn around and loan that back out. And it's easier if we kind of use the context of maybe loaning it out to individuals who are entrepreneurs who maybe want to start their own businesses. That way it really keeps us in the context of investments. Okay, so the idea here is we're going to take households who are saving, okay, and so they're going to save, and they maybe are going to go and put their money into a bank, and that bank then is going to turn around and loan that money back out to other individuals who are looking to start a business, and therefore those individuals are going to be investing. And just to keep it in the context of saving and investing, that's why I'm using this context. And then we're going to take a look at how these government policies would affect things like savings, investment, and the interest rate. We have to make some assumptions under our models. Again, remember, a model is just a simplification of reality. So we're going to say that all savers deposit their savings into this bank, okay, or into this market that we're going to use. Again, that's not necessarily true. We know that savers don't deposit all of their savings into a particular market, that many people use different types of vehicles for savings, but we're going to make the assumption that everyone's saving in this bank. And we're also going to say that everyone borrows from this particular bank or takes out loans from this bank. We're going to say that there's only one interest rate, and again, that we know is not true. But let's take a moment and think about that for a moment. Think if you're a saver. Do you want a high interest rate or a low interest rate? Yeah, savers want a high interest rate. So I'm going to use INOM as the nominal interest rate. So savers really want a high interest rate. Okay, so they want that interest rate to be as high as it possibly can be. Whereas borrowers, individuals borrowing money, if you've ever borrowed money for a house or a car or something like that, you know that you want the lowest interest rate possible. So it's kind of interesting that the two have very different ideas about what they want the interest rate to be. So this financial intermediary, in this example, the bank, has to kind of come up with an interest rate that meets the needs of both areas. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about in this context. Okay, so where does the bank get its money? Well, the bank gets its money from savers. Okay, so if you have extra income, again, kind of going back to that idea that we spoke about in Learning Objective 2, if you have extra income, again, taking GDP, subtracting out taxes, and subtracting out consumption, everything that's left over, all of the private savings, then you would put all that savings into the banks, and then the banks could then turn around and loan that back out, and that would become the supply of loanable funds. Okay? Now, if negative, it reduces national savings and the supply of loanable funds. We're going to come up with that in just a moment. Now, public savings, that's the idea about what is it that the government is doing. So again, that's that taxes less government spending. And so if that's positive, then that's beneficial, and that increases the supply of loanable funds. But if this ends up being negative, where the government is spending more than it's bringing in, then that reduces the amount of loanable funds, and it's actually detrimental to the economy. Okay, so our second primary objective under Module 7, Learning Objective 3, is to draw and label the supply and demand diagram for loanable funds. So let's go ahead and do that. Here we have the supply of we have the slope of the supply curve for loanable funds. And so basically this kind of illustrates, and I just want to take a moment and explain this because we didn't do a lot of graphing so far in the course. So let's just kind of take a step back from this graph for just a moment. So the supply of loanable funds goes along the x-axis and the interest rate goes along the y-axis. The supply of loanable funds really comes from savers. And we can think about it this way. Savers really are private savers. That's that private savings that we talked about in Learning Objective 2, plus public savings. And so if we combine the two, we end up with national savings. So the supply of loanable funds really is national savings. Okay? So again, if we think about it this way, the higher the interest rate, the more enticed we are to put money into a savings account. And that's really what this is saying. At 3% here, we only have 60 billion people who are willing to put money into this account, whereas when the interest rate increases or goes up to 6%, then people are more enticed to save, so the supply of loanable funds goes up. So we can take away from this idea as the interest rate or the nominal interest rate goes up, then the supply of loanable funds or national savings then increases. The two are positively correlated. That's why the supply curve here is positively correlated, showing that loanable funds increases as the interest rate increases. And that kind of makes sense if you think about saving your money, and the higher the interest rate, the more enticed you are, or the higher the opportunity cost, as opposed to sitting on your money at home. Okay, the demand for loanable funds really kind of comes from the idea of investment. Again, kind of the idea that we're looking at capital here. Again, that idea that we looked at in chapter 25. So here, individuals are taking out loans to start an entrepreneurial adventure, and so what they want to do is borrow funds for equipment and factories, maybe to buy a new house. Again, we're looking for those underlying physical assets here, and you can see those very clearly in this particular example. So we look at that in this graph. Notice again that the demand for loanable funds, again I'm going to take a step back here for just a moment, demand for loanable funds is on the x-axis, interest rate is on the y-axis. So you think about if you're going to get a loan, you want a low interest rate. So we could say that the nominal interest rate, when the interest rate goes down, the demand for loanable funds increases. So the demand for those loanable funds increases. What's also interesting if we look at this is think about this demand for loanable funds in the larger context of the national income accounts. So the demand for loanable funds really comes from this idea, do people want to invest in this economy? So the demand for loanable funds comes from people wanting to invest in our economy. So it really comes from that investment idea or the need to provide capital in our economy. So when the interest rate decreases here, it's 7%, individuals only wanted to take out about 50 billion in loans. Notice as the interest rate decreased to 4%, then individuals wanted to take out many more loans because as the interest rate decreases, then the demand for loanable funds increases. They move opposite one another, so the demand for loanable funds is negatively correlated to the interest rate. They move opposite one another. We can now put these two concepts together. And remember when we worked on this with our variables, or algebraically if you want to put it that way, we said that national savings, right? National savings. So let me write that up here. National savings was equal to investment. Well, this is interesting. If we pick this apart just a little bit, remember the supply of loanable funds comes from national savings. So I'll just write nat savings here. okay, which we know comes from both private plus public. Okay? Demand for loanable funds is investment. This is where it gets interesting. Notice where savings is equal to investment is right here where these two cross. We would call this equilibrium in microeconomics, and really it's the same thing in macroeconomics. Where national savings is equal to investment then becomes the interest rate for this economy. Here it's 5%. And at where national savings equals investment is also where the quantity of loanable funds is at. So in this economy, the quantity of loanable funds is $60 billion at a 5% interest rate. So we would call that equilibrium investing and equilibrium saving. Our third objective is to describe how government policies, things like, for example, savings incentives, investment incentives, or government budget deficits and surpluses affect this supply and demand diagram for loanable funds. So let's go ahead and do that. The first policy we have is a savings incentive. So let's think about that for just a moment. So what kind of incentive could the government use to encourage people to save? And a lot of people think, well, they could manipulate the interest rate. Well, they could, but let's not use that at this context because that's more of a Federal Reserve, and we haven't really talked a lot about that. So 9 times out of 10, it really goes back to this tax idea. So let's say that the government decides to decrease the capital gains tax. Capital gains tax happens when if you invest, for example, and I'll just kind of let me minimize this maybe as I discuss it. That might be a better way to do it. So let me kind of come over here for a moment. So let's say that you invest $10,000 into an interest-bearing account, and that interest-bearing account pays 10%. Let's just keep this easy, okay? And at 10%, you're going to earn $1,000, okay? And so what happens is this $1,000 that you earn is going to be taxed because it's a gain, okay? And this discourages some people from saving. Even though you're gaining this interest, right? Principal times rate times time. So you're gaining this interest. This interest is then going to be taxed, and it could be taxed as much as 30%, depending on if it's taxed at the capital gains rate. So if it's taxed at 30%, you're automatically going to lose, let's see, in our example, $300 is going to be taxed, so you're only going to end up with $700 on that's what you're going to net from this investment. So that kind of discourages people. And so what we want to do then is perhaps one of the savings incentives we might have here, I'm going to go ahead and erase that then. One of the savings incentives that we might have here is that we decide then to not allow or to maybe reduce the amount of capital gains tax. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so we can discuss it a little bit more now. Make sure that's a little more better. Okay. All right. So let's say that the government reduces taxes. So they reduce capital gains. That would be one thing that they could do here. And so if they do that, what would happen is the very first effect, we would start off, and let's see where our very first effect is here. We would start off at savings 1, this line right here, savings 1, and we would have a 5% interest rate and 60 billion loanable funds. Okay, so I'll write I1. And I'll just write loan 1, okay, just to keep us straight. Well, once they reduce the capital gains tax, that would entice people to save. That's why we call it a savings incentive. The supply curve then, or the savings curve, national savings, more people, private savings would increase, which would shift the supply curve out, in this case to S2. And notice what the effect would be. The interest rate would then decrease, kind of interesting, and The supply of loanable funds, though, which is a good thing, would increase. So we would actually end up reducing the interest rate. So the interest rate would fall. This is our net effect. The interest rate would fall, but the supply of loanable funds, the amount of money we can loan back out and invest in our economy, would actually increase. So think about it this way. Might not be good for savers, but it would be very enticing to borrowers. So this could spur investment in our economy. And that would be a good thing because that could create jobs, and it would be enticing for individuals to want to get loans. So that's actually a good thing. Let's go ahead and look at our next incentive, which is actually an investment incentive, looking at the demand side of the loanable funds market. The second policy incentive looks at the demand side. So let's just get our bearings here about where we're at. And so, again, kind of starting with our original demand curve here. So we're starting right here at 5% interest rate, and we have 60 billion loanable funds. So that's where we're starting in this graph. So I'll just say I1 and L1. So we have 60 billion loanable funds at an interest rate of 5%. Now what the government's going to do is target individuals seeking loans. So what's some things that we might be able to do? And again, students like to talk about interest rates. Well, let's save that for a later topic. So the government in this case might give a tax credit. And one popular one might be solar panels, right? We want to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, so we might give a tax credit. If you decide to put in solar panels, or you decide to put in alternative energy sources in your home, you might take advantage then of a tax credit. So you would get a reduced income tax. So that would be awesome, right? You get some tax credit back. So that's good. So that would mean that more people would go down to their bank and they would want to get loans in order to get solar panels, let's say. That would cause then the demand curve 1 here, where we were at, that would shift out, as you see here, to demand 2. Our new equilibrium then, we would see, let's put right here. Notice the effect. The interest rate would go up to 6%, and the loanable funds would move out to L2, in this case to 70 billion. So what's the net effect? Well, we give a credit. The credit encourages people to seek loans to put in alternative energy into their homes. That shifts out the demand for loanable funds. That increases the interest rate goes up. The supply of loanable funds increases. Again, may not be good for borrowers, but for those savers, now they're going to be more enticed to save. And guess what? That will also help increase the supply of loanable funds, which can then again turn around, and more savers then will be enticed to save. So savings, national savings will actually go up as well. And some of you might be saying, well, what eventually will happen? Well, eventually will happen with the higher interest rate. Savings will actually move out somewhere over here, and we'll end up at kind of a new normal, which is somewhere over there. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting idea, and this is always moving in terms of what the government and policy making is doing. Let's see what happens when the government runs a budget deficit or a budget surplus. Okay, so use the loanable funds market to analyze the effect of a deficit. Show the diagram in equilibrium and then see what happens when they run a deficit, and then draw the new curve. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to go ahead and minimize this just a wee bit so that we can kind of draw a graph and a curve. So remember, actually let me minimize it just a little bit more. Graphing takes a little more room. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and draw. Again, we have the interest rate over here, and we have the loanable funds down here. Okay. Go ahead and put the demand in here, which remember this is demand, which is equal to investment. We then have national savings. Okay, we know that we're at an equilibrium interest rate, so I'll just use 5% because that's what we've been using in our graph, and then I'll go ahead and put 50, and we'll keep these also in billions because that's what we've been doing. Okay, so remember that savings is national savings. So this is made up of public, Y minus T minus C, plus T minus G. Now, if the government runs a deficit, what happens to national savings? Let's say originally that national savings was 10, just for kicks and giggles. Let's say it was 5 from private and 5 from public. So national savings was 10. Now the government's going to run a deficit. So instead of it being 5, I'm just going to erase the original 5. Now it's going to end up being, let's say, 2. Okay, well, it's still not a deficit, so let's make it a real deficit. Let's say it's -1. So we no longer have 10, do we? We have 4. 5 minus 1. What's going to happen is the supply of loanable the supply curve, or national savings, is going to shift left, inward, and to the left quite a bit in this example, and we're going to shift it inward to S2, going from 10 to 4. The interest rate is going to increase greatly, from 5 to maybe, looks more like 9% to me. And here's the important part. In every other example of the government intervention, the supply of loanable funds increased. But look what happens this time. The supply of loanable funds decreases, and it decreases pretty substantially, maybe to about 35. So when the government runs a deficit, national savings decreases. This shifts the supply curve, or national savings, shifts inward. This drives up the nominal interest rate. When it drives up the nominal interest rate, the most important part of this is it decreases the amount of loanable funds. This means that we no longer can have the same amount of investment in the economy. So what happens is the government, by running this deficit, is in a way taking away from some of the private savings. Because if we think about it, we had 5 of private savings, but because the government ran a deficit, they kind of dipped into our private savings, didn't they? So we should, in reality, if we're saving a citizen 5, then 5 should be going back into investment in the economy. But in actuality, when we're running a deficit, we're saving 5, but only 4 is going back into the economy. So because the supply of loanable funds decreases, the amount investment in our economy falls, which is not good, because that means that we're not creating as much capital, we're not creating as many jobs, and that's detrimental for our economy. So this just kind of looks at that idea, and there's our answer. Again, the interest rate goes up, supply of loanable funds goes down. And this idea is called the crowding out effect. When the government runs a deficit, it means that we are not, the amount of national savings that we have, or that we should have, is not being put back into the economy to spur investment. So, increased budget deficit causes an investment in our economy to fall. The government has to borrow to finance its debt, And this is that crowding out effect. And again, investment is really important in terms of our long-run economic growth. And there are some economists, in fact, one I'm reading right now, that says we cannot sustain this long-run economic growth. And the reason we can't do it is because it's dependent on investment. And investment, like all resources, are scarce. And we're hitting the ceiling in particular areas, specifically our natural resources. So, economists argue about, is this the end of growth? I don't know. Being hotly debated. So government debt is really something that we need to be concerned about. And we need to take a look at it. And it's not something that we hear a lot about. If we look at charts, and I'm going to show you these charts, but I also want for you to look at the charts that I put on Canvas, because when we look at the amount of government debt, I have yet to hear some real good solutions about how to fix this. And you can see it comes at a cost of investment in our economy. And that's very disconcerting to me, and it should be to all citizens. So here we see the chart of U.S. government debt. Obviously, it got higher during times of war. And what's interesting is we were able to take down that debt in some reasons because of war. People went to work. People were able to produce things. But what's interesting is that wars are no longer fought in the same way anymore. And so looking for a war to put people back to work or to restart an economy is not going to work in the same way. And again, be careful, because this is as a percentage of the gross national product. Okay, so just to summarize, again, we still believe that financial markets are the best ways to organize economic activity. And again, that they help allocate economies' resources. And they enable us to take a look at converting our current income into future purchasing power. We're going to discuss this more in upcoming chapters. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you in Module 8. Thanks.